I bought this house to protect my family. Then one piece of paper made me feel like I didn't own it at all. That sentence kept repeating in my head as I stood on my front porch, keys still warm in my hand, staring at the place I had worked my entire adult life to call home. This house wasn't an impulse or an upgrade. It was the result of years of overtime, skipped vacations, worn-out cars, and nights spent telling myself the sacrifice would be worth it if my wife and kids had somewhere safe to sleep. From the day we moved in, I treated this home like a responsibility, not a trophy. I fixed things myself, learned the neighborhood, waved to the same neighbors every morning. When crime started creeping closer to our area, my concern wasn't property value or appearances, it was my family. That's why I installed smart home devices, a doorbell camera, exterior sensors, simple technology meant to give me peace of mind when I was at work and my kids were inside. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about convenience. It was about being able to check my phone and know my front door was secure, about getting alerts if someone stepped too close at night. I honestly believed any reasonable person would understand that. Then one afternoon, I came home and saw a bright notice taped right to my door, flapping slightly in the wind like it was proud of itself. HOA violation. Those two words made my stomach drop. I stood there longer than I should have, rereading it, convinced there had to be some mistake. Unauthorized exterior modification. Failure to comply would result in fines. My name was printed neatly at the top, like a warning meant only for me. Shock hit first, then confusion. I hadn't damaged anything. I hadn't changed the structure. I hadn't even spoken to anyone about it because I never imagined I needed permission to protect my family. As the reality set in, fear crept in quietly. Not panic, something colder. The kind that makes you realize someone else thinks they have power over your life. That was my first real introduction to the HOA's authority, not as a helpful group of neighbors, but as an invisible hand that could reach into my home whenever it wanted. Standing there, notice shaking slightly in my hand now, I felt something shift inside me. The comfort I'd always felt walking up that driveway was gone. In its place was uncertainty. I told myself it was probably a misunderstanding, a box checked by accident, a letter that would be laughed off once I talked to the right person. I peeled the notice off my door and folded it carefully, like it might explode if I crumpled it. I had no idea that this piece of paper was the beginning of a fight I never asked for, and that the person behind it was already watching. I walked inside, trying to act normal, but my chest felt tight. The house sounded different, quieter, like it was listening. I looked at the walls, the door, the camera that started all of this, and for the first time I felt exposed. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a notice. It was a test, and I didn't yet know who I was being tested by. Only that the next conversation would decide whether I stayed silent or finally spoke up. At that moment, I believed it was a small issue, never realizing it would soon drag my home, my rights, and my peace into open conflict ahead. Linda Whitmore didn't talk to me like a neighbor. She talked to me like I was already guilty. That feeling followed me into the HOA meeting room a few days later, still carrying the unease from that notice on my door. I walked in expecting a conversation, maybe even an apology for the confusion. Instead, I walked into a space where I immediately felt out of place, like I was there to be judged rather than heard. Linda was already seated at the head of the table when I arrived. She didn't stand to greet me. She didn't smile in a friendly way. She looked up over her glasses, paused just long enough to make me uncomfortable, and then gestured for me to sit as if she were doing me a favor. That was my first face-to-face interaction with her, and it set the tone instantly. She wasn't interested in who I was or why I was there. She was interested in control. As I explained why I'd installed the smart home devices, I kept my voice calm. I talked about safety, about working long hours, about wanting to know my family was okay when I wasn't home. Linda didn't nod. She didn't ask questions. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, lips tight, like she'd already made up her mind before I said a word. Her tone was flat and cold when she finally spoke, the kind of tone that shuts conversations down instead of opening them up. She didn't respond to my concerns about safety at all. She didn't acknowledge the reality of the world we live in or the responsibility I felt as a husband and father. Instead, she repeated the same phrase over and over. The rules are the rules. Every time I tried to explain, she interrupted me with another reference to the bylaws, sliding printed pages across the table like evidence in a trial. It wasn't a discussion. It was a lecture. What bothered me most wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. She spoke slowly, deliberately, like I was either too stubborn or too simple to understand. Other board members sat quietly, avoiding eye contact, letting her dominate the room. I realized then that this wasn't just her personality, it was her position. She wore that title like armor, and she knew exactly how much weight it carried. Sitting there, I felt myself shrinking, not because I believed I was wrong, but because the environment was designed to make me feel small. This was my neighborhood, my community, and yet I felt like an outsider asking permission to exist. Linda never once used words like neighbor or community. She used words like violation, non-compliance, and penalty. It was clear she didn't see me as someone to work with. She saw me as someone to manage. That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't really about smart home devices. It wasn't about appearance or consistency. It was about power. Linda enjoyed enforcing rules more than understanding people. She enjoyed reminding homeowners that she had authority over them, even inside their own homes. The rules were just her shield, something she could hide behind while making personal decisions feel official. As the meeting came to an end, I gathered my papers, still hoping for some sign of compromise. Linda stood up, finally meeting my eyes, and her expression hardened. She told me I had a choice: remove the devices or face escalating fines. She said it casually, like she was talking about the weather, but her words landed heavy. Then she leaned slightly forward and added that continued non-compliance could lead to further action. I walked out of that room with my heart pounding, realizing this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a warning. And as I stepped back into my quiet street, I knew the next move wouldn't be mine alone. Linda had made it clear, if I didn't comply, she was ready to show me just how far she believed her power reached. They were judging my modern home using rules older than my kids. That thought sat heavy with me the night after my meeting with Linda, long after the house had gone quiet. I couldn't sleep, not because I doubted myself, but because none of what she said made sense. So I did what she clearly didn't expect me to do. I pulled out the HOA bylaws and started reading them myself. The document was thick, yellowed in places, and written in a tone that felt frozen in time. As I flipped through page after page, it became obvious these rules were created for a very different world. A world before smartphones, before smart doorbells, before anyone could check on their family with a tap of their finger. Yet here I was, being judged by those same outdated words as if nothing had changed in decades. I found the section Linda kept quoting. External devices, it said, without explanation or examples. No definitions, no context, just vague language that could mean almost anything if someone wanted it to. There was nothing about security technology, nothing about cameras, nothing about modern safety systems. It was written broadly enough that someone with enough authority could twist it however they wanted, and that realization made my jaw tighten. The more I read, the more frustrated I became. These rules talked about satellite dishes and visible wiring, about things that were relevant years ago. There was no acknowledgement that homes, families, and threats had evolved, yet the HOA wasn't interested in adapting or interpreting the rules in a reasonable way. They were using silence in the language as a weapon, not a gap to be filled with common sense. I thought back to Linda's tone, the way she dismissed everything I said without hesitation. She never once admitted the rules might be outdated. She never paused to consider whether safety should matter more than appearance. Instead, she hid behind the bylaws like they were sacred, unchangeable laws rather than guidelines created by people who could be wrong. That's when the frustration really set in. I wasn't being punished for breaking rules. I was being punished for being responsible, for trying to protect my family, for using tools that didn't exist when those rules were written. The irony was hard to ignore. If something had happened to my home, no one from the HOA would have taken responsibility. But the moment I took responsibility myself, they were ready to step in and stop me. Sitting there at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. This wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about community standards. It was about forcing homeowners to live in the past because the people in charge refused to move forward. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't an accident. It was a choice. I realized then that Linda and the board didn't want to interpret the rules reasonably because reasonable interpretation would weaken their control. If they admitted the rules were outdated, they'd have to admit limits to their authority, and that was something they weren't willing to do. As I closed the binder and looked around my kitchen, I felt the weight of it all pressed down on me. This house was supposed to represent stability. Instead, it felt like I was being tested for stepping outside invisible lines drawn years before I ever moved in. I knew I couldn't ignore what I'd learned. The rules were weak, but the way they were being used was dangerous. And just when I thought the situation couldn't get more unreasonable, the next letter arrived. This time, it didn't read like a reminder or a request. What came next felt less like a warning and more like a threat. The moment they mentioned a lien, I felt real fear for the first time. Not irritation, not frustration. Fear, the kind that settles deep in your chest and doesn't move. Because suddenly this wasn't about rules or meetings anymore. It was about my future. I knew something was wrong the second I saw the envelope. Certified mail. Official. Heavy. It sat on the kitchen counter like it didn't belong in my home. I opened it slowly, already sensing the tone before I read a single word. The letter wasn't from the HOA board directly this time. It was from their attorney. That alone changed everything. The language was sharp and formal, stripped of any pretense of neighborly concern. It laid out the fines I had supposedly accumulated, listing dollar amounts that made my stomach turn. Then it explained their authority to place a lien on my home if I failed to comply. I had heard the word lien before, but seeing it directed at me felt unreal. The letter spelled it out. Clearly, continued non-compliance could affect my credit, my ability to refinance, even my ability to sell my home. This wasn't about correcting behavior anymore. This was financial pressure, plain and simple. They weren't trying to work with me. They were trying to scare me into submission. I sat down at the table and read the letter again, slower this time. Every sentence felt calculated. Every word reminded me that this organization believed it had the power to reach into my life and pull whatever lever it wanted. I thought about my mortgage, about how hard we worked to stay ahead, about the stability this house represented. The idea that someone else could threaten all of that over a security camera made my hands shake. When my wife came into the room, she knew something was wrong immediately. I handed her the letter, watching her expression change as she read it. I could see the stress hit her all at once. Questions followed. What does this mean? Can they really do this? What happens if they don't stop? I didn't have clear answers, and that made everything worse. The fear wasn't just mine anymore. It spread through the room, settling into our marriage, our sense of safety. What hurt the most was realizing how targeted this felt. This wasn't guidance. This wasn't correction. It was punishment. There was no acknowledgement of intent, no consideration of safety, no room for compromise. Just escalating consequences. And at the bottom of the letter, clear as day, was Linda Whitmore's signature. Seeing her name there made it personal in a way that turned my fear into anger. The signature told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't some automatic legal step. This was a decision. Linda had chosen this path. She had looked at my situation and decided pressure was the answer. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that if I kept trying to appease them, it would never be enough. Giving in once would only invite more control later. I looked around my kitchen, at the photos on the wall, at the life we'd built inside this house. I felt cornered, but I also felt awake. This was the emotional turning point I didn't know I needed. Fear had gotten their attention, but it didn't own me. That night, after the kids were asleep and the house was quiet, I made a decision. I wasn't going to ask for permission anymore. If they wanted a fight, they'd have to justify it. Because I finally understood something important, this wasn't just about my home. It was about whether I was willing to let someone else decide how far their power reached. I started reading the rules myself, and realized they weren't as powerful as they claimed. That decision came late at night, after the house had finally settled into silence. The fear from that certified letter was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't paralyzing me anymore. It was pushing me to understand what I was really up against. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the HOA bylaws spread out beside me, and a cup of coffee I didn't really need. The clock crept past midnight as I searched through state statutes, legal forums, and homeowner advocacy pages. This wasn't casual curiosity anymore. This was survival. I needed to know whether Linda and the HOA actually had the power they were threatening me with, or whether they were counting on my ignorance. What I found surprised me almost immediately. Buried beneath all the intimidating language and legal tone were clear limits on what an HOA could and couldn't do. State law didn't treat HOAs as all-powerful authorities. They were restricted, bound by reasonableness, required to act within clearly defined boundaries. The more I read, the more cracks I saw in the image of control Linda had been projecting. One of the biggest things I learned was the distinction between aesthetics and safety. HOAs could regulate appearances within reason, but safety measures were treated differently. Security devices weren't decorations. They weren't cosmetic changes meant to boost curb appeal or uniformity. They served a functional purpose, protecting people and property. That difference mattered, and it wasn't something the HOA could simply ignore because it was inconvenient. I realized then that Linda had never once acknowledged that difference. She lumped everything together under the same vague rule and used it as a blunt tool. But the law didn't work that way. Authority had to be justified, not assumed. Interpretation had to be reasonable, not aggressive. And suddenly, the letter threatening a lien didn't feel as solid as it once had. As the night went on, fear slowly gave way to clarity. I wasn't crazy for questioning this. I wasn't wrong for wanting to protect my family. The HOA's authority had boundaries, and those boundaries had been crossed. That realization didn't erase the stress, but it changed how I carried it. I stopped feeling hunted and started feeling informed. I thought back to every interaction with Linda. The way she spoke, the way she dismissed me, the way she leaned on rules without explanation. It made sense now. She wasn't explaining the limits of her power because she didn't want me to know they existed. The system worked best for her when homeowners stayed quiet and compliant. By the time I closed my laptop, the sun was just starting to hint at the horizon. I was exhausted, but for the first time since this started, I felt steady. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. I drafted a response to the HOA, carefully worded, referencing the bylaws they cited and the state laws they ignored. I wasn't aggressive. I was clear. Hitting send felt different than anything I'd done before. It wasn't defiance for the sake of pride. It was standing on facts instead of fear. I knew this might provoke a reaction, but I also knew staying silent would only invite more pressure. And sure enough, it didn't take long. When I pushed back, calmly, legally, and confidently, Linda didn't soften. She didn't reconsider. She escalated. Because the moment I stopped being afraid was the moment she realized control was slipping, and she wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. Every time I spoke up, they fined me more. That pattern became impossible to ignore once I sent my response to the HOA. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I simply asked them to explain their authority and acknowledge the limits I had found in the law. I expected pushback, maybe another tense meeting. What I didn't expect was retaliation disguised as enforcement. Within days, new violation notices started appearing. Not just one, several. Each one referenced the same issue, yet each came with a higher fine than the last. There was no hearing, no discussion, no opportunity to respond. Just numbers climbing higher, as if they were daring me to keep resisting. It felt less like a process and more like a punishment for speaking up. Then the public notices started. My address appeared in HOA emails listing non-compliant properties. Seeing my home called out like that hit harder than I expected. Neighbors I'd waved to for years suddenly stopped making eye contact. Conversations went quiet when I walked by. I could feel the judgment, even if no one said a word. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge authority. What hurt most was the silence. No one reached out. No one asked what really happened. I later realized why. Fear. Everyone knew Linda's reputation. Everyone knew fines could pile up fast. Staying quiet was safer than being next. Understanding that didn't make it easier, but it made it clearer. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how power was being used to keep people in line. I felt isolated in my own neighborhood. The place that once felt welcoming now felt tense and cold. At night, I replayed every interaction in my head, wondering if I should have handled things differently. But every time doubt crept in, I came back to the same truth. I wasn't wrong. I was being punished for questioning something that deserved to be questioned. The HOA board meetings made it worse. Each time Linda sat confidently at the front, presenting fines and actions as if they were routine. The rest of the board nodded along, approving everything without discussion. No one asked for clarification. No one challenged her interpretation. They weren't governing, they were rubber stamping. Watching that happen made it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding within the board. It was a system that rewarded obedience and crushed resistance. I tried once more to speak, calmly explaining that fines without hearings weren't reasonable. Linda didn't even look at me this time. She simply reminded the room that enforcement was necessary to maintain order. Order. That word echoed in my head as I sat back down. Order for who? Certainly not for the homeowner being singled out. That meeting was the breaking point. Driving home afterward, I felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. I couldn't keep standing alone against an organization that had resources, lawyers, and a president who clearly enjoyed flexing her authority. This had gone beyond something I could handle by myself, no matter how right I knew I was. That night, I talked it through with my wife again. The stress was showing on both of us. We agreed on one thing. We couldn't let fear dictate our next move. Staying silent hadn't protected us. Being reasonable hadn't slowed them down. The fines were still coming, and the pressure wasn't easing. I sat there with my phone in my hand, hesitating for a moment. Calling a lawyer felt like crossing a line, like turning a neighborhood dispute into something bigger. But then I looked at the latest notice on the counter, another fine added without explanation, and I understood something important. They had already crossed that line, so I stopped trying to handle it alone. That's when I made the call that changed everything. That's when I called a lawyer. My attorney said one sentence that changed everything. They don't have that power. I remember sitting across from him in a small office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, still carrying the weight of every fine and threat the HOA had thrown at me. I laid everything out. The notices, the letters, Linda's emails, the escalating penalties. I half expected him to tell me I was stuck, that HOAs could do whatever they wanted. Instead, he leaned back, scanned the documents, and said those words calmly, like they should have been obvious all along. He walked me through it piece by piece. The HOA's actions, he explained, weren't just aggressive. They were legally questionable. Fines issued without hearings. Vague rules enforced as absolute law. Threats of liens without proper justification. As he spoke, the picture became clear. This wasn't strict enforcement. It was overreach. The kind that happens when people in power assume no one will challenge them. What shocked me most was learning how much protection homeowners actually have under state law. I'd been made to feel powerless for weeks, but the law didn't see me that way at all. There were limits to what an HOA could regulate, especially when it came to safety measures. They could suggest, they could request, but they couldn't bully or intimidate homeowners into compliance just because it suited them. He explained that authority isn't automatic, it has to be exercised reasonably. HOAs couldn't simply declare something a violation without clear language and fair process. And they certainly couldn't ignore intent or context. Hearing that felt like someone opening a window in a room I'd been suffocating in. For the first time since this started, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. Together, we reviewed the bylaws again, this time through a legal lens. The vague language Linda relied on didn't give her the control she claimed. If anything, it exposed how much she was stretching interpretation to suit her agenda. My attorney pointed out inconsistencies in their enforcement and documented every step where they failed to follow proper procedure. Each note felt like reclaiming a small piece of control. As the meeting went on, we began building a strategy. Not an emotional reaction, not a loud confrontation, but a deliberate, lawful response. Letters would be sent. Demands for due process would be made. If necessary, we'd be ready to defend my rights in court. The idea of that still made my stomach tighten, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an option. Walking out of that office, something inside me had changed. The fear that once drove my decisions had faded into determination. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was prepared. I understood where the HOA's authority stopped, and more importantly, I understood where my rights began. That confidence followed me home, settling into places that had been tense for weeks. I looked at my house differently that evening, not as something under attack, but as something worth defending properly. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Linda wasn't the type to admit she'd gone too far. People who rely on power rarely let go of it willingly, but now I knew the truth, and I knew she knew it too. We sent the formal response shortly after, laying out the legal issues clearly and respectfully. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't emotional, it was firm. I thought, maybe naively, that this would be the moment things cooled down, that once faced with the facts, the HOA would back off and rethink their approach. They didn't. Instead of acknowledging the limits of their authority, they chose escalation. Papers were filed. Positions hardened. The message was unmistakable. They weren't interested in compromise. They wanted a fight. And just like that, what began as a notice on my door turned into something much bigger. Instead of backing down, the HOA took me to court. Standing in court against my HOA felt unreal, but backing down felt worse. When my attorney told me the HOA had officially filed a lawsuit, I sat there in silence, letting the words sink in. This wasn't a warning anymore. This wasn't intimidation behind closed doors. This was my own neighborhood taking legal action against me for refusing to remove security devices from my home. The place I paid dues to every month was now trying to drag me through the court system. The paperwork made it painfully real. My name printed across the top as the defendant. The HOA listed as the plaintiff. Seeing it laid out that way felt like a betrayal I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't some reckless homeowner causing chaos. I was a father who installed cameras to protect his family. Yet here I was, being treated like a problem that needed to be dealt with publicly. The emotional weight of it all was heavier than I expected. Every time I looked at the documents, my chest tightened. Court meant time off work, legal costs, and uncertainty. It meant explaining to my kids why Dad was stressed and distracted. It meant lying awake at night, wondering how far Linda and the HOA were willing to go just to prove a point. Preparation became my new routine. I gathered every notice, every email, every fine. I printed photos of the devices, copies of the bylaws, and highlighted sections of state law. My attorney walked me through what to expect, but no amount of preparation could fully take the edge off the fear. This wasn't just about winning. It was about defending my right to live reasonably in my own home. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I wanted. Walking into the courtroom, I felt out of place, like I didn't belong there. Linda, on the other hand, looked completely at ease. She sat with the HOA's attorney, posture straight, expression confident. She didn't look at me once. It was as if this was just another meeting to her, another opportunity to assert control. As proceedings began, Linda's attitude didn't change. She spoke through her attorney, but her presence was loud. Everything was framed as enforcement, order, and compliance. Safety wasn't mentioned. Intent wasn't mentioned. It was all about authority. Watching her, I realized how accustomed she was to people backing down long before things reached this point. Then the judge started asking questions. Not the kind Linda expected. He asked about the age of the bylaws. He asked about hearings. He asked whether the HOA had considered the purpose of the devices instead of just their appearance. With each question, the tone in the room shifted. The confidence on Linda's side started to waver. I could feel the power dynamics changing in real time. The courtroom wasn't like an HOA meeting. Titles didn't carry the same weight here. Authority had to be explained, not assumed. For the first time since this began, Linda wasn't controlling the narrative. The judge was. As I listened, a quiet sense of relief crept in. Someone was finally looking at this situation with fresh eyes. Someone wasn't intimidated by fines or threats. Someone wanted facts. I sat up a little straighter, realizing this was exactly why the law mattered. It created a space where power could be questioned. Then the judge paused, flipped through the documents once more, and looked directly at the HOA's attorney. The room went still. The next question he asked wasn't something anyone on their side seemed prepared for. And in that moment, I knew everything was about to change. The judge asked where the HOA's power actually stopped, and the room went quiet. Not the awkward kind of quiet from an HOA meeting where people avoid conflict, but a heavy silence where everyone suddenly realized this wasn't going the way they expected. I felt it immediately. The confidence Linda had carried into the courtroom faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough to change everything. The judge began methodically examining the HOA bylaws, flipping through the same pages Linda had leaned on for months. Only now those pages weren't being treated as unquestionable authority. They were being scrutinized. He read sections out loud, pausing at phrases that were vague, outdated, and open-ended. External devices, he repeated, looking up. That's not very specific, is it? No one answered right away. As he continued, it became clear what I had felt all along but hadn't been able to articulate until now. The language was old. It referenced concerns and technologies that no longer reflected how people live today. There was nothing about smart security, nothing about safety considerations, nothing that clearly gave the HOA the power they claimed to have. The rules sounded strong when Linda recited them in a meeting room, but under legal examination, they felt thin. Then it was my turn to speak. I stood up, my hands steady but my heart pounding, and told my story plainly. I talked about working long hours, about wanting to know my family was safe when I wasn't home. I explained that I hadn't installed the devices to challenge authority or break rules, but to be responsible. I spoke about the fines, the threats, and how quickly things escalated once I questioned their interpretation. The judge listened closely, asking clarifying questions, not interrupting, not dismissing me. For the first time since this started, I felt like a homeowner instead of a problem. I explained how no one from the HOA had tried to work with me, how every response had been punishment instead of conversation. Saying it out loud, in that room, made it real in a way I hadn't fully processed before. When the judge turned back to the HOA's side, he directed his questions toward Linda. He asked how the board determined enforcement without hearings. He asked whether any consideration had been given to safety versus aesthetics. He asked how they justified escalating fines without offering due process. Linda tried to answer, but her words lacked the confidence she'd shown before. She deferred to the attorney, then jumped back in, then stopped again. The authority she relied on wasn't holding up. It was clear the court wasn't focused on protecting HOA power. It was focused on protecting homeowner rights. The judge emphasized reasonableness, fairness, and proportional response. He spoke about how authority has limits and how enforcement must align with both the letter and the spirit of the law. Sitting there, I felt a sense of balance being restored. Linda's posture changed as the questions continued. She shifted in her seat, glanced at her attorney more than once, and avoided looking in my direction. The dynamic had completely flipped. This wasn't her boardroom. This wasn't her meeting. She couldn't talk over anyone here. She had to answer, and those answers weren't coming easily. As the judge closed his binder and leaned back, the room held its breath. Everything that had been building since that first notice on my door had led to this moment. The bylaws had been examined. The overreach had been exposed. The human side of the story had finally been heard. The judge nodded slowly, as if the conclusion had already formed in his mind. My attorney rested a hand on the table, calm and composed. Across the room, Linda sat rigid, her authority stripped down to what it really was. The judge cleared his throat and said he was ready to rule. The ruling came moments later. When I won, I didn't smile. I finally breathed. The judge's words landed calmly, almost casually, but they carried the weight of months of stress, fear, and pressure. The case was dismissed. Just like that. No dramatic pause. No raised voice. One clear decision that cut through everything the HOA had tried to build against me. The judge stated plainly that the HOA had overstepped its authority. The enforcement actions were unreasonable. The fines were excessive. The lack of hearings violated basic standards of fairness. Sitting there, listening to it laid out so clearly, felt surreal. Everything I'd been saying from the beginning was finally being said by someone who mattered in a room that couldn't ignore it. He went further than I expected. The court didn't just dismiss the case. It reprimanded the HOA for its conduct. The judge emphasized that authority does not mean unchecked power, and that homeowners are not subjects. He made it clear that rules written decades ago could not be twisted to punish modern safety decisions without clear justification. Hearing that out loud felt like someone restoring order after months of chaos. Then came the financial consequences. The HOA was ordered to absorb its own legal costs. Certain fines issued against me were invalidated. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was overreach, and it came with consequences. For the first time, the pressure wasn't on me. It was on them. I glanced toward Linda as the ruling was read. Her expression was tight, controlled, but the confidence she'd carried into the courtroom was gone. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. She sat still, eyes forward, absorbing a reality she clearly hadn't prepared for. This wasn't the outcome she expected, and it showed. Power doesn't disappear loudly. It fades when it's challenged successfully. As the hearing ended, my attorney quietly shook my hand. I thanked him, but the words felt small compared to what I was feeling. Relief washed over me, slowly, not all at once. My shoulders dropped, my jaw unclenched. I realized how tense I'd been for so long that I'd forgotten what calm felt like. Winning didn't bring joy, it brought release. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt lighter, but also grounded. This wasn't about revenge or proving someone wrong. It was about validation, about knowing I hadn't imagined the imbalance, the pressure, the unfairness. The system worked. Not perfectly, not quickly, but it worked. And that mattered more than celebration. I stepped outside and took a deep breath, the kind you don't realize you've been holding. The world felt normal again. Cars passed, people talked, life moved forward, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could move with it instead of being dragged behind. But as calm as that moment was, I knew something else too. This ruling didn't exist in a vacuum. It would ripple outward. Linda had lost publicly. The HOA had been exposed. Neighbors would hear about it. Questions would be asked. Confidence would shift. I looked back once at the courthouse doors before turning away. This chapter was over, but the story wasn't finished. Because when fear breaks, it doesn't just free one person. It changes a whole community. And as I drove home, I realized the neighborhood I was returning to would never be the same. Once people saw the HOA could lose, they stopped being afraid. I felt it almost immediately after the court ruling, even before I pulled into my driveway. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for months suddenly waved. One stopped me to ask how it went. Another sent a quiet message that night saying, I'm glad someone finally stood up. It was like something invisible had cracked open. Over the next few days, the stories started coming out. Neighbors knocked on my door or caught me while walking the block, speaking in low voices at first, like they were confessing something. One family talked about fines for a fence repair that had been approved years earlier. Another mentioned being threatened over holiday decorations. A retired couple admitted they'd paid thousands in penalties just to keep the peace. The common thread was always the same: fear. Everyone had been afraid of becoming the next target. What surprised me most was how long people had been carrying it. Some of these issues went back years. Linda's name came up every time, usually followed by the same phrase: "It just wasn't worth fighting." Hearing that made me realize how deeply control had settled into this community. The rules weren't just enforced, they were feared. It didn't take long for the pressure to reach the HOA board. An emergency meeting was announced, and for the first time since I'd lived there, the room was full. Not the usual handful of quiet homeowners, but dozens of people standing along the walls, arms crossed, voices ready. The atmosphere felt different, tense but not submissive. Linda sat at the front, like always, but something was off. The confidence she once carried wasn't there anymore. The court ruling had stripped away the illusion of invincibility. When the meeting opened, hands shot up immediately. Questions poured in about fines, enforcement, and authority. People weren't whispering anymore. They were speaking clearly, publicly, and without apology. Then came the vote. A motion was raised questioning Linda's leadership and the board's actions. It wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. One by one, homeowners voted. The outcome was clear before the final count was announced. Linda was voted out. Just like that. No speech, no defense. Power left the room the same way it enters, through people. A leadership change followed quickly. New board members were elected, people who spoke about balance instead of control. The tone shifted almost overnight. Enforcement policies were reviewed. Fines were paused. Language in the bylaws was flagged for revision. For the first time, the HOA talked about homeowners as people, not problems. Policy reform didn't fix everything instantly, but it opened the door to healing. Neighbors started talking again. Kids played outside without tension hanging in the air. The neighborhood felt lighter, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. What had once felt divided slowly began to reconnect. As I watched it happen, I felt something unexpected. Pride, not in myself, but in the community. People weren't angry anymore. They were empowered. They realized the HOA wasn't some untouchable force. It was made of people, and people could be held accountable. One evening, I stood in my driveway as the sun went down, listening to the sounds of normal life returning. Laughter, footsteps, conversations drifting through the air. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to feel like. Not silent, not afraid, alive. I knew this change wouldn't have happened without the court ruling, but more importantly, it wouldn't have happened without people seeing that standing up was possible. Fear had kept everyone isolated. Once it broke, the community found its voice. As things slowly settled, one thought stayed with me. A simple but powerful lesson I wouldn't forget. Fear only works when people believe they're alone. Owning a home should never mean giving up your voice. That truth didn't fully sink in until everything was over. After the court ruling, after the HOA changed, after the fear lifted from the neighborhood. Standing in my living room one quiet evening, I looked around at the walls we painted, the floors we fixed, the space where my kids grew up, and I realized how close I'd come to letting someone else define what this place meant to me. Home ownership isn't just about paying a mortgage or following rules. It's about responsibility, yes, but it's also about dignity. It's about having a say in how you protect your family, how you live your life, and how you use the home you worked so hard to earn. Somewhere along the way, my HOA had lost sight of that balance. They focused so much on control that they forgot who they were supposed to serve. This experience taught me that standing up doesn't always look loud or aggressive. Sometimes it looks like reading the fine print, asking questions, refusing to accept fear as normal. I didn't set out to challenge anyone. I just refused to stay silent when something felt wrong, and that choice changed more than just my situation. It reminded others that they weren't powerless either. I think about other homeowners now, the ones dealing with unfair notices, vague rules, or leaders who talk down to them instead of listening. If that's you, I want you to know something important. Modern life requires modern solutions. Smart homes aren't about luxury. They're about safety, efficiency, and peace of mind. The world changes, and the rules that govern our homes need to recognize that. Freedom doesn't mean ignoring community standards. It means being treated fairly within them. It means having rules that make sense, leadership that listens, and systems that respect the people they affect. When those things break down, speaking up isn't selfish, it's necessary. I didn't win because I was special or powerful. I won because the law still recognizes homeowners as individuals, not subjects. Because authority has limits. Because dignity matters. And because one person refusing to be intimidated can remind an entire community of its strength. As I lock my door at night now, the same doorbell camera still quietly watching over my home, I feel something deeper than relief. I feel grounded. This house is still my responsibility, but it's also still my voice, my choice, my freedom. And I'll never forget this. The next homeowner an HOA overreaches might be you. If you're dealing with an HOA that's gone too far, don't assume they're untouchable. Learn your rights. Speak up, and never forget, you paid for that home.